A majestic tiger roams the jungle, embodying its untamed spirit. A young girl is abandoned on a stormy night, crying on an empty road. The two meet in an unbelievable moment of trust and connection. What follows is a battle to protect the jungle that will change their lives forever. The village was nestled deep within the heart of the jungle, its wooden huts hidden among the thick foliage of towering trees. The dense forest stretched endlessly in every direction, a world of lush greens, vibrant wildlife, and ancient secrets. The villagers, simple and content, lived in harmony with the land. They revered the jungle for its beauty and bounty, but also for its power. The jungle was their protector and their provider, but it was also unforgiving. At the edge of the village, the great forest seemed to loom like a sentient being, watching over the lives of the people with a quiet, almost mystical presence. And at the heart of this presence, known to the villagers as the guardian of the jungle, roamed Sundar, a majestic tiger whose eyes gleamed like molten gold and whose silent steps moved through the underbrush like a shadow. To the villagers, Sundar was more than a creature of flesh and bone. He was the spirit of the jungle itself, a living embodiment of the forest's ancient power. His presence was both a blessing and a warning, a reminder that nature was as capable of fierce protection as it was of quiet beauty. That night, the wind howled through the trees and the air was thick with the scent of rain. The storm had come without warning, dark clouds smothering the moon, turning the jungle into a world of shadows. The villagers huddled in their homes, listening to the rain pounding against their thatched roofs, waiting for the storm to pass. But in the heart of the jungle, Sundar moved silently, his powerful body slipping through the rain-drenched foliage. His instincts told him that something was wrong. There was an unfamiliar scent in the air, a scent of fear, of loneliness. It was on the winding road that cut through the jungle, leading from the village to the distant valley, that Sundar found her. She was small, a child of no more than 6 or 7, her figure barely visible against the dark backdrop of the storm. She sat on the edge of the road, her thin body trembling as the rain soaked her through. Her hair, matted to her face, obscured most of her features, but Sundar could see the tear-streaked cheeks and the way she hugged her small doll tightly to her chest. She was crying, her sobs breaking the silence of the night. Sundar paused, his keen eyes narrowing as he studied the girl. It wasn't unusual for the jungle to give birth to strange events, but this was something different. A child alone and abandoned in the middle of the night, in the heart of the jungle. His instincts, honed over years of navigating the wild, told him that something was terribly wrong. He took a step forward, his powerful body moving with the grace of a shadow. His massive paws left no sound in the soft earth, and yet the girl heard him. She stopped crying for a moment, her body stiffening as if sensing something approaching. Her eyes, wide and frightened, darted around the dark road, but she didn't run. She didn't scream. She simply sat there, clutching the doll as if it were her only anchor to the world she once knew. Sundar stepped closer, his body towering over her small form. The air between them crackled with tension. A tiger was not a creature to be taken lightly, and yet there was no fear in the girl's eyes, only quiet resignation. She didn't flee, nor did she raise her arms in defense. She was too lost in her own grief to see the danger. The tiger stopped just inches from her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Sundar's golden eyes locked onto hers, and in that instant, something unexpected happened. The fear, the hesitation that had always been in the eyes of those who encountered him, was absent. In its place, there was only an unspoken understanding, a recognition of something deeper. Sundar's gaze softened, and for reasons unknown to even him, he lowered his massive head toward the girl, sniffing her damp hair. She flinched slightly at his breath, but didn't pull away. Slowly, ever so gently, Sundar nudged her with his nose, urging her to stand. It was a strange, almost tender gesture from the king of the jungle, a creature known for his untamed ferocity. The girl looked up at him, her wide, tearful eyes filled with something unexpected. Hope. A tiny, uncertain smile tugged at the corners of her lips. For the first time since the storm had begun, she felt perhaps for the first time safe. Sundar's deep, rumbling growl echoed in the stillness of the jungle. It was not a growl of warning, but one of assurance. He turned and looked back at the village, the path leading home. The girl hesitated for only a moment before, guided by the silent assurance of the tiger beside her, she stood and slowly climbed onto his broad back. The storm raged around them, but the night, it seemed, had already begun to change. The rain had lessened by the time Sundar carried Mira toward the village, his mighty steps leaving deep impressions in the soft earth. The storm, though still present in the air, had retreated from the forest canopy, and the jungle seemed to breathe a little easier. Mira, her small form perched on the tiger's broad back, felt the warmth of his fur against her damp skin, an unexpected comfort in the cold, wet night. As they moved through the jungle, her sobs had quieted, and she seemed to grow more aware of her surroundings. Sundar, though silent, could sense the shifting emotions within her. There was something both fragile and strong in her presence, a kind of quiet determination. Eventually they reached the village's edge, where the lights of the houses flickered like tiny stars in the night. The villagers stood at their doors, watching with awe and disbelief as Sundar approached, carrying Mira. But before they could react, Mira spoke softly, her voice still raw from crying, but now filled with an undeniable sadness.
They left me,
She whispered, her words barely audible over the distant rumble of thunder.
They told me they had to go, but I knew. I knew they didn't want me anymore.
Sundar halted and lowered his head so he could meet her eyes, his golden gaze filled with a deep, knowing calm. Mira looked at him with a mixture of trust and confusion. The storm had washed away the edge of her fear, leaving a quiet vulnerability. The tiger seemed to be waiting, listening, as if he too could understand the weight of her words.
They're not my real parents,
She continued, her voice trembling.
but they took care of me. They said I was special, that the forest was special.
Mira hugged the small wooden doll to her chest, as if it could shield her from the world. The doll was worn, its clothes faded, and its face was chipped. But to Mira, it was the only piece of the past she had left.
They said the jungle needed me,
She added, looking at Sundar with wide, searching eyes.
but now they're gone.
Sundar let out a low, comforting rumble. The words Mira spoke made little sense in the moment, but they were heavy with meaning. The jungle had its secrets, its rhythms, and its voices, and it was clear to him that Mira had a deeper connection to it than any child he had ever encountered. Mira's voice faltered as she gathered her thoughts, the storm of emotions still swirling inside her.
They said the outsiders would come. They would hurt the jungle, make it sick.
She whispered, glancing over her shoulder as if the shadows themselves might be listening.
My parents, they tried to stop them. They tried to warn the village, but no one would listen. The outsiders said it was just trees, but it's not just trees. It's the jungle. It's the heart. They said it would all be gone soon and no one could stop them.
She paused, looking down at the doll once again, her fingers tracing its chipped face with a tenderness that spoke of lost love.
They left me with the doll.
She said quietly.
They said it was to keep me safe, that it had magic, that it would help me find my way. But I don't know how. I don't understand.
Sundar watched her with quiet patience, his enormous form still as a statue. His mind, sharp as a blade, processed the words, the fragments of a broken story that had been thrust upon this small girl. Mira's connection to the forest, her parents' warnings, the outsiders who sought to destroy the jungle, it all intertwined in a way that Sundar knew was not by chance. The jungle had a way of choosing its protectors, and this child, though young, was linked to it in a way few could comprehend. Mira's voice grew softer, almost distant, as she continued her tale.
I don't remember much. I was just a baby when they found me. They said the jungle gave me to them, that I was meant to be a part of it. My real parents were the jungle, they said. I never understood. I never asked why, because I always felt like it was the truth. But now I don't know who I am without them.
She bit her lip as if trying to hold back a sob, but the tears came anyway. The doll, once something of little importance to anyone but Mira, now held an even deeper meaning. It was not just a keepsake, not just an object to hold when she was lonely. It was a symbol, a link between her parents, and the jungle itself. Something about the doll's worn face, its quiet resilience, seemed to carry the weight of her parents' hopes. It was a silent promise they had left behind for her, a promise to protect the jungle, to carry on their work. Mira pulled the doll closer to her chest, her grip tightening as though she feared it would disappear.
I don't know what they wanted me to do. They said to stay safe, and that if the forest ever called for me, I would know. I would know what to do.
Her small fingers traced the doll's face again, her voice barely a whisper.
But I don't know how.
Sundar's golden eyes never left her. His mind, ancient and wise, understood more than she could possibly know. The jungle had called to her. She had been left here for a reason, even if she couldn't yet understand it. Perhaps, just like the forest, Mira was a keeper of something sacred, something beyond the comprehension of outsiders or even the villagers. She wasn't just a lost child. She was a guardian in her own way. The storm was subsiding now, the rain a soft patter on the earth. Mira's tears, though still present, seemed to quiet. She felt the tiger's presence beside her, a silent strength she could not explain but deeply felt. The doll in her hands, the last link to her parents, seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't understand. But she didn't need to understand. Not yet. Sundar lowered his head to her, and in that moment, Mira felt the weight of his gaze, as if he had silently accepted the bond between them, between her, the jungle, and the legacy she carried. There was much Mira didn't understand, but she knew one thing for sure. The jungle had not abandoned her, and neither had Sundar. The path to the village was narrow and winding, flanked by towering trees that swayed gently in the lingering breeze of the storm. Sundar walked steadily, his massive form moving with an eerie grace despite the weight of the small girl on his back. Mira clung to his fur, her tiny hands gripping tightly but not fearfully. The storm's rage had diminished, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of night creatures. The jungle seemed to hold its breath, as if watching this unlikely pair make their way through its depths. When they reached the outskirts of the village, Sundar stopped, his golden eyes scanning the clearing ahead. The flicker of oil lamps illuminated the small cluster of wooden huts, their thatched roofs glistening with rain. Smoke curled lazily from a few chimneys, mingling with the damp night air. Sundar's ears twitched, catching the hushed murmurs and hurried footsteps of the villagers. The news of his arrival had already spread. The first to appear was an older man, his face lined with age and worry. He froze mid-step, his lantern trembling in his hand as his eyes fell on Sundar.
The tiger,
He whispered, his voice a mix of awe and fear. More villagers emerged, their faces pale and cautious as they gathered in a loose circle, keeping a safe distance from the tiger.
Sundar,
Someone whispered, their voice trembling.
the guardian spirit.
But then they noticed the child on his back. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Mira lifted her head, her damp hair framing her pale face. She looked small and fragile, but her calmness, her utter lack of fear, sent a ripple of confusion through the villagers.
What is this?
An older woman murmured, clutching her shawl tightly.
A child with the tiger?
Is she controlling it?
Someone else asked, their voice tinged with suspicion. The villagers began to whisper among themselves, their words carrying both reverence and unease. To them, Sundar was a symbol of the jungle's power, untamed, dangerous, and sacred. He was not a creature to be trifled with, let alone approached. Yet here he was, calmly standing in their midst with a child on his back, as if he had chosen to protect her. Mira slid off Sundar's back, her small feet sinking into the muddy ground. She wavered slightly, but the tiger nudged her gently with his nose, steadying her. The villagers watched in stunned silence, unsure of what to make of the scene.
she's not afraid.
One man finally said, his voice breaking the tension.
Why would Sundar bring her here?
Another asked.
What does it mean?
Mira stepped forward, her arms still clutching the wooden doll to her chest. Her eyes, though red from crying, held a quiet determination.
He saved me.
She said softly, her voice carrying over the murmurs.
He found me when I was alone.
The villagers exchanged uncertain glances. Some took a cautious step back, while others moved closer, their curiosity outweighing their fear. Sundar, sensing the unease, let out a low growl, not threatening, but enough to silence the murmurs.
Maybe she's blessed.
One woman said, her tone hesitant but hopeful.
Maybe Sundar brought her to us for a reason.
Or maybe she's a curse.
Another muttered, earning a sharp glare from the older man with the lantern. As the debate simmered, Mira knelt beside Sundar, her small hand resting on his broad shoulder. The gesture was simple, but it spoke volumes. To her, Sundar was not a beast to be feared. He was her protector, her guardian. And slowly the villagers began to see it too. One by one, their expressions softened. They saw the way Mira leaned on Sundar, the way the tiger stood still and calm, his golden eyes watching over her with an almost human understanding. It was as if he had taken her under his protection, claiming her as one of his own. The village elder stepped forward, his face thoughtful.
The jungle has always protected us,
He said, his voice steady.
Perhaps this is another way it speaks to us. If Sundar has brought her here, we must honor that.
The villagers murmured in agreement, though some remained wary. Slowly they began to disperse, their fear giving way to cautious acceptance. As the crowd thinned, the elder knelt beside Mira, his weathered hands resting on his knees.
Child, where are you from? Who brought you to the jungle?
Mira hesitated, her fingers tightening around her doll.
The outsiders,
She said softly.
they left me.
The elder's brow furrowed, and the tension in his shoulders returned.
Outsiders.
He repeated. The word carried a heavy weight in the village, a reminder of the men who had come with machines and promises, only to leave destruction in their wake.
They said they needed the trees.
Mira continued, her voice trembling.
They said the jungle doesn't matter, but it does. It does matter.
The elder nodded gravely.
Yes, child. It matters more than they know.
The villagers had been struggling against the outsiders for months, strangers who came with axes and chainsaws, clearing patches of the jungle for reasons no one fully understood. The villagers had protested, pleaded, but their voices had gone unheard. The jungle, their home, was being taken piece by piece. Now as they looked at Mira, they began to wonder, could this child brought to them by Sundar be a sign? A reminder that the jungle had not given up on them, even if the world outside had? Mira stayed close to Sundar, her presence and calmness around the tiger slowly dissolving the last of their doubts. They didn't fully understand her connection to the jungle, or why Sundar had chosen to protect her. But one thing was certain, the jungle was speaking to them, and they would need to listen. The next morning the storm clouds had cleared, leaving the village bathed in the soft glow of early sunlight. The jungle glistened with rain, its vibrant greens and earthy browns alive with the hum of life. But the air was heavy with unease. The villagers gathered in the central square, their eyes darting between each other as they whispered about the girl and the tiger who had brought her. Sundar had returned to the edge of the jungle, a silent sentinel watching over the village from the shadows. Mira sat quietly on a wooden stool outside the elder's hut, clutching her doll as if it were the only thing tethering her to the moment. The elder, known as Banu, sat across from her, his weathered face filled with both concern and curiosity. Around them, a handful of villagers stood, listening intently.
Mira,
Banu began gently.
you said last night that the outsiders left you. Can you tell us more? Who were they and what did they want with the jungle?
Mira hesitated, her small hands fidgeting with the doll's worn dress. Her wide, searching eyes glanced toward the jungle, where she knew Sundar was waiting. Somehow, his presence gave her strength. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak.
They came in big trucks.
She said, her voice soft but steady.
They had machines that made the trees fall down. They said they needed the wood to build things. But it wasn't just about the trees.
She looked up at Banu, her expression serious beyond her years.
They said the jungle was in the way. They wanted it gone so they could build roads and factories. They said it didn't matter because no one would stop them.
Gasps rippled through the small crowd. The villagers had long suspected that the outsiders were planning something big, but hearing it confirmed, and from a child, sent a chill through them.
They talked about a logging project.
Mira continued, her brow furrowing as she tried to recall the details.
They said they were going to clear a huge part of the jungle. They didn't care about the animals or the people who live here. They just wanted the money.
Panu's face darkened.
And your parents?
He asked softly.
You said they tried to stop them?
Mira nodded, her grip on the doll tightening.
My real parents, they were gone before I could remember. But the people who took care of me, they said my parents loved the jungle. They were trying to protect it. They said the jungle was alive and that it needed people to speak for it.
Tears welled up in her eyes, but she wiped them away with a fierce determination.
They tried to stop the outsiders. They went to their camps and they told them to leave. But one day they didn't come back. The people who took care of me said it was too dangerous to stay. They told me I had to be strong, that the jungle would always protect me, and then they left me too.
The villagers listened in silence, the weight of Mira's words sinking in. Her story was a puzzle, but the pieces were beginning to fit together. The outsiders weren't just cutting down trees. They were planning to destroy the jungle itself, turning it into something unrecognizable. And Mira's parents had been among the few who had tried to stand in their way.
We need to know more.
Panu said finally, his voice firm.
If the outsiders are planning something this big, we can't just sit and wait for it to happen. We have to act.
A young man named Hari, one of the few villagers who had ventured beyond the jungle to nearby towns, stepped forward.
If what Mira says is true, then the logging company must have records, plans, maps, something. I've seen their camps before on the edge of the valley. They're guarded, but not impossible to get into.
Panu nodded.
Then we'll investigate, but we must be careful. The jungle has always been our home, and it's protected us in ways we can't always see. We must honor that protection while defending it.
Over the next few days, the villagers worked quietly but diligently. They moved through the jungle with the stealth of its native creatures, gathering information and piecing together the extent of the outsiders' plans. Mira, despite her young age, became an invaluable source of knowledge.
They had maps,
She told them one evening, her voice hushed as she sat by the fire in Panu's hut.
big maps with red lines on them. They said the lines showed where they'd cut first. It was near the river, where the trees are tallest. They said it would make it easier to bring the wood out.
Hari, who had just returned from a scouting trip near the logging camp, nodded grimly.
She's right. I saw the machines near the riverbank. They've already started marking the trees. If we don't stop them soon, they'll clear half the jungle before we even realize it.
The villagers shared uneasy glances. The jungle wasn't just a collection of trees to them, it was their home, their heritage, their lifeblood. To see it destroyed would be to lose a part of themselves. As the investigation continued, more pieces of the conspiracy came to light. The logging company, it seemed, had bribed officials in the nearby city to ignore the destruction they were causing. They had promised the villagers jobs and development, but those promises were nothing more than empty words. In reality, the company cared only about profit, and they saw the jungle as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. Mira's role in uncovering the truth became increasingly clear. Her sharp memory and the fragments of conversation she had overheard from the outsiders painted a chilling picture. But her greatest revelation came late one evening as she sat with Panu and Hari by the fire.
My parents,
She said softly, staring into the flames.
they said the jungle has a voice, that it speaks to people who listen. I didn't understand what they meant before, but now I think they were right.
Panu frowned, leaning closer.
What do you mean, child?
Mira looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet certainty.
I feel it.
She said.
When I'm in the jungle, I feel like it's alive, like it's watching and waiting. My parents believed the jungle could protect itself, but it needed people to help. That's why they fought so hard.
Her words hung in the air, resonating with an unspoken truth that the villagers had always known but rarely acknowledged. The jungle was more than just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, and it had chosen them as its guardians. Panu placed a hand on Mira's shoulder, his expression solemn.
Your parents were right, Mira. The jungle does have a voice, and now through you, it's speaking to us.
The villagers looked at each other, their resolve hardening. The outsiders' plans were clear now, and so was their duty. They would not let the jungle fall. They would protect it, not just for themselves, but for the generations to come. And with Mira's courage and Sundar's silent strength guiding them, they knew they could succeed. The village awoke before dawn, the air thick with anticipation and purpose. The soft rustle of leaves and the faint calls of waking birds were the only sounds as the villagers gathered in the central square, their faces solemn. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes flickering between Sundar, the majestic tiger seated at the edge of the clearing, and Mira, who clutched her doll tightly, but stood tall and resolute. The plan had taken days to finalize. The villagers would confront the outsiders at their main logging site near the riverbank. Hari and a few others had scouted the area, identifying weak points in the outsiders' operation and confirming the presence of documents that could expose their illegal activities. But it wasn't just strategy that fueled the villagers. It was the knowledge that their home, their heritage, and their way of life depended on this confrontation. Sundar rose slowly, his massive frame casting an imposing shadow. His golden eyes met Bhanu's, the elder who had taken charge of organizing the villagers. No words were exchanged, but an understanding passed between them. Sundar was not just a guardian of the jungle, he was a symbol of its strength, and his presence gave the villagers courage. As the group moved through the jungle, Sundar led the way, his steps silent despite his size. The villagers followed closely, armed not with weapons, but with tools of their everyday lives, sickles, farming implements, and torches. Their resolve was clear. They would not fight with violence, but with unity and determination. Mira walked beside Bhanu, her small figure dwarfed by the adults around her, but her expression was one of quiet strength. She had shared everything she remembered about the outsiders, their plans, their conversations, and even the names she had overheard. Her knowledge had been crucial in forming the plan, and though she was only a child, the villagers now saw her as a key figure in their fight. As they approached the riverbank, the hum of machinery grew louder, breaking the jungle's natural symphony. The smell of diesel hung in the air, and the once pristine landscape was scarred by felled trees and churned-up soil. The logging site was a stark reminder of what was at stake. The villagers spread out, forming a semicircle around the site's perimeter. The workers, men in hard hats and uniforms, paused as they noticed the crowd. At first, they seemed confused, their movements slowing as they registered the villagers' presence. But then, one of them shouted, and a man in a crisp suit emerged from a nearby tent. The man, tall and broad-shouldered, adjusted his tie and strode toward the villagers with an air of authority. His name was Mr. Roy, the logging company's manager, and he exuded the kind of confidence that came from years of unchecked power.
"What is this?"
He barked, his voice cutting through the tension.
"You people have no right to be here. This land is company property."
Bhanu stepped forward, his back straight and his voice steady.
This land is the jungle's, and the jungle belongs to us. You have no right to destroy it.
Mr. Roy sneered, glancing at the villagers as if they were an inconvenience.
"You think you can stop us? We have permits, government approval. This project is legal."
Hari, standing near the front, stepped forward, holding up a bundle of papers he had taken from a worker's tent during the scouting mission.
Legal?
He challenged.
We've seen your permits, Roy. They're forged. And we've found the bribes you paid to officials to keep quiet. You're not just destroying our home, you're breaking the law.
A ripple of murmurs spread through the workers, some of whom looked uneasy. Mr. Roy's confident facade faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, his expression hardening.
"You think waving a few papers around will stop us?"
He snarled.
"Get out of here before I call the authorities."
Bhanu took a step closer, undeterred.
Call them,
He said calmly.
Let's see how they respond when we show them your forged permits and bribe records. Let's see what they say about the destruction you've caused.
Before Mr. Roy could reply, a low growl rumbled through the air. The villagers parted as Sundar stepped forward, his golden eyes locked on the man in the suit. The workers froze, their faces pale as the tiger moved with deliberate purpose, his massive paws silent on the trampled earth. Mr. Roy took an involuntary step back, his bravado cracking under the weight of Sundar's presence.
What is this?"
He stammered, his voice trembling.
This
Bhanu said, his voice steady.
is the jungle's guardian. Sundar doesn't take kindly to those who harm his home.
Sundar stopped a few feet from Mr. Roy, his gaze unwavering. The tiger didn't growl or bare his teeth, but his mere presence was enough to send a clear message. The workers began to back away, their earlier confidence replaced by fear and uncertainty. Mira stepped forward then, her small voice cutting through the tension.
You need to leave.
She said, her tone calm but firm.
The jungle doesn't belong to you. It's alive and it will fight back.
Mr. Roy's eyes darted between Mira and the tiger, sweat forming on his brow. For a moment it seemed like he might argue, but the weight of the villagers' resolve and Sundar's silent warning was too much.
You'll regret this.
He muttered, his voice lacking its earlier force. Turning to his workers, he barked,
Pack it up. We're leaving.
The workers hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances, but the sight of Sundar and the determined villagers left them little choice. Slowly, they began to shut down the machines and gather their belongings. As the outsiders retreated, Bhanu turned to Hari.
Take these documents to the authorities,
He said.
Let them see the truth.
Hari nodded, tucking the papers securely under his arm.
They won't get away with this.
He promised. The villagers watched in silence as the last of the outsiders' trucks rumbled away, leaving the scarred landscape behind. Sundar let out a soft huff, his body relaxing as the threat disappeared. Mira knelt beside him, resting her hand on his massive shoulder.
Thank you.
She whispered. The villagers began to cheer, their voices rising in a triumphant chorus. They had won, not through violence, but through unity, courage, and the strength of their bond with the jungle. The jungle's voice, carried by Mira and embodied by Sundar, had been heard. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the canopy, the villagers stood together, their resolve stronger than ever. The jungle was still scarred, but it was alive, and it would heal. And with Sundar watching over them, they knew it would remain protected for generations to come. The village awoke to a new day, bathed in sunlight that filtered through the jungle canopy. The storm of conflict had passed, and a sense of peace settled over the community. The sounds of life had returned to the jungle, chirping birds, rustling leaves, and the distant call of monkeys swinging through the trees. The air, though still tinged with the faint scent of diesel and disturbed earth, felt lighter, as if the jungle itself had exhaled in relief. The villagers gathered in the central square, their faces lit with joy and pride. Children ran about, laughing, while the adults prepared a celebratory feast from the fruits of the jungle. For the first time in weeks, the looming shadow of destruction had lifted, replaced by the warmth of hope and unity. Mira stood in the midst of it all, her small figure now familiar to every villager. Though she had only arrived days ago, she had become a part of their lives, a symbol of the jungle's resilience and a bridge between its mysteries and their reality. Clutching her doll tightly, she watched as the villagers worked together, their smiles reflecting a newfound strength. Bhanu approached her, his weathered face soft with affection.
Mira,
He said, kneeling to meet her gaze.
you've done more for this village than you'll ever know. You've reminded us of who we are and what we're fighting for. The jungle owes you its thanks, and so do we.
Mira's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her doll.
I didn't do it alone.
She said quietly.
The jungle. It helped me. And Sundar.
At the sound of his name, Sundar stepped into the clearing, his massive form moving with the grace of a shadow. The villagers turned to him, their initial fear now replaced with reverence. To them, Sundar was no longer just a tiger, he was a guardian, a living symbol of the jungle's spirit. One by one, the villagers approached him, bowing their heads or whispering words of gratitude. Sundar watched them with his golden eyes, his expression unreadable, but his presence unmistakably calm. When Mira stepped forward and placed her small hand on his shoulder, the villagers erupted into cheers. That evening, as the feast began, Mira found herself surrounded by warmth and laughter. Plates of fruit, rice, and roasted vegetables were passed around, and stories of the villagers' bravery filled the air. Mira, though still a child, felt a sense of belonging she hadn't known since her parents disappeared. Hari, sitting beside her, leaned down and smiled.
You know, Mira,
He said,
you're part of this village now. You've done more to protect the jungle than most of us ever have. We're proud to call you one of our own.
Mira's heart swelled and tears pricked her eyes.
Thank you.
She whispered, her voice trembling.
I think my parents would be happy. They always wanted the jungle to be safe.
They would be proud of you.
Bhanu said from across the fire, his voice carrying the weight of certainty.
and we will honor their legacy by continuing to protect this land.
As the night deepened, Mira sat with Sundar at the edge of the clearing, gazing up at the stars that dotted the sky. The jungle around them buzzed with life, its sounds a comforting lullaby. She ran her fingers through Sundar's thick fur, her thoughts drifting to everything that had happened.
You saved me.
She said softly, her voice barely above a whisper.
I don't know why you came to me that night, but I think you knew I needed help.
Sundar let out a low rumble, his way of acknowledging her words. Mira smiled, leaning her head against his side.
I thought I was alone,
She continued.
but I wasn't. The jungle was always there, and so were you. Together we stopped them. We saved this place.
She looked out at the village where the firelight flickered and the laughter of the villagers rang out.
I think my parents would want me to stay here,
She said.
to help protect the jungle like they did.
Sundar turned his head to her, his golden eyes meeting hers. For a moment it felt as though he understood her completely, as though the bond between them transcended words. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, the villagers began to stir. Mira rose from her spot beside Sundar, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. She knew her journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt at peace. Panu gathered the villagers one last time, his voice steady and filled with hope.
We faced a great challenge, No,
He said,
but we stood together and we prevailed. The jungle has always been our home, and now it is our responsibility to protect it, not just for ourselves, but for future generations. Mira has reminded us of that, and we will honor her parents' legacy by ensuring that this land remains alive and thriving.
The villagers cheered, their voices echoing through the jungle. Mira stood among them, her small frame radiating strength and determination. As Sundar retreated into the jungle, his silhouette blending into the trees, Mira watched him go with a sense of gratitude and awe. He was the jungle's spirit, its protector, and its heart. Though she knew he would always be near, she also understood that his place was in the wild, guarding the land he loved. Mira turned back to the village, her new home, and smiled. The jungle, the village, and the people had saved her, just as she had saved them. Together, they had forged a bond that could never be broken. And as the sun rose higher, casting its golden light over the jungle, Mira felt a deep sense of purpose. The jungle was alive, and so was she. They had fought for their future, and they had won. In the end, it wasn't just the power of nature or the strength of the villagers that had saved the jungle. It was their unity, their courage, and their willingness to fight for what they loved. And in the heart of it all was a small girl and a majestic tiger whose bond had changed everything. The jungle would endure, and so would its people. Together, they were unstoppable.